Today, I'm talking with author Karla Perry about her recent book and how the past impacts the present. Hi, friends. I'm Teresa Janzen. I'd love to keep in touch with you, so hit subscribe and leave a comment. Welcome to Drawn Onward. I'm your host, Teresa Janzen, and today I have a special guest with me. This is Karla Perry. Karla, welcome to Drawn Onward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Well, I'm super excited for our conversation, and I see that you are sitting in the midst of a lovely library. So I have a question for you. What are you reading right now? What would we find on your nightstand if we could see?
I'm in the middle of 3 books right now. I'm reading one on the history of American literature. I'm at the tail end of that one. I'm reading Charles Taylor's Secular Age, which is a huge, thick one, which I kind of started and haven't read a whole lot of yet, but I'm working on that this year. And I'm reading a pop fiction book as well. I have to try some light reading in order to get the hard ones read.
That sounds like a good plan. When I was young, I used to read, well, I do still read multiple books at once, but usually nonfiction books, I read multiple. But when I was young, I would have 2 or 3 fiction books going at a time.
My husband and I love reading. We both read 52 books last year with everything shut down during COVID. He had done 52 before, and I've been trying ever since. And I met my goal last year. And this year, I've taken it a lot slower.
Well, I think coronavirus or the pandemic has been good for people in some ways. Of course, it's been challenging in a lot of ways, but it's been interesting to hear. It's been a good time for people to get some writing done as well. I've talked to a few people who wrote their first book during the pandemic. And today we're going to talk about a book that you've written, but not during the pandemic. But you do have a book. Why don't you tell us just the name of that book and maybe a little bit about what it's about or what the goal of the book is?
Okay. Yeah, my recent book is The Reformation of America. And I did write it before the pandemic, but I released it like a couple months before everything, probably about 3 or 4 months before everything shut down. And then I got sick and lost my voice. So I wasn't able to do a lot of promoting, and then COVID hit. So then that was kind of, didn't do much promoting after that. But I wrote it because I love, I've always loved American history. And I've learned in recent years about how much the Bible has impacted America and how much discipleship from our Christian roots created America, how much of the Reformation went into building America. And so I have very short chapters to go into little bits of history of important people who shaped America, important ideas that shaped America, and important concepts we need to keep in order to preserve America and all nations, how nations work with economics and capitalism and how that's healthy for a nation.
Well, that's really interesting. I also love history, but I can't say that it was my favorite subject in school because I had a real hard time with remembering all the facts associated. But I love the narrative part of history, the stories of history and the impact that it has. And that sounds like it's a lot of what you're talking about is the impact of history on present day.
Yeah, I mean, like I talk about Noah Webster and how he created a language for a nation by creating the dictionary. He unified our language to provide an American language of all the different spellings and dialects and schools and books and stuff. He brought it all together so we could start creating more of an American identity. And that was his desire with it, was to pull us together and unify us. And so I tell his story. I tell McGuffey story about how one-room schoolhouses and early American education.
I really like the idea of Noah Webster. I hadn't thought about it in that essence before, but some people know that I teach English in Juba, South Sudan at a theological college. And I was telling one of my friends who's from UK that I was teaching English at the theological college. And she said, well, how can you teach English? You don't even speak English. You speak American. And I said, well, that's true.
Yeah. It is different. I mean, I haven't traveled much, but from reading a lot, I realized that English and the British English and the American is very different, but that gives us our identity as distinct, from where our heritage is, from the British colonies.
That's true. It does bring a lot of identity. And even though there's unity, there is still a lot of diversity in the American English as well. And
Oh, yeah.
I watched a special one time on television called Do You Speak American? And it was about the different American dialects and differences in the language around the different regions of the country. More
Yeah.
so historically, I think it's come together a little bit more as people have become more mobile,
Mm.
but there are still distinctives. And I always think that that's interesting when you can tell where someone is from based on their accent or their colloquialisms.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of difference from the North and the South, and more Southern you get, the more different versus the more North. If you put someone very Northern with someone very Southern, you hear a very different dialect.
And then the idea of the Reformation is also interesting because I always think about the Reformation as being kind of a European event. But tell me more about how that influenced or impacted America.
Well, because it made the Bible popular in a new way with the printing press. The Bible is actually the first book printed in the United States. It was actually printed by the United States government. So yeah, we were the first book, and the government is the one that printed that for us here. It was the King James Bible at that time. And so it was very influential in the beginning of our country. So the ideas of freedom, capitalism, all people being created equal, all these were biblical ideas that were rooted in the Reformation. We went from, even freedom of religion, freedom of worship, those things are Christian, because even though there was a time where we killed heretics, burned them at the stake, and all kinds of horrific things, the applied theology began to develop since the Reformation, where that's not the right way to do things, because they applied the Bible more to a healthier perspective. And as that began to develop, that gets enumerated in our Constitution, Declaration, that all men are created equal, that we all have this dignity, even though it wasn't applied to everybody initially the way it should have been. It's there in our founding documents, rooted in the Reformation, so that we can draw upon them today to keep trying to make that happen more equitably for everyone.
Well, it sounds like, okay, we have a really great foundation and that was established in this country. How do you see that being played out and impacted today? What's the progression of that?
I feel like today there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. There's a lot of wanting to bury that past and start fresh without realizing that without those ingredients, we can't have a free nation. So we really need to pull it forward. We really need to understand it instead of abolish it. And I'm trying really hard to hear the different perspectives and to provide almost a mediating voice between the different perspectives, and be like, I understand why you might not want these people venerated, but if we get rid of their ideas, we get rid of America. And so we need to have a way to pull that forward in a way that's healthy, in a way that we can still honor the foundations and honor our forefathers. Because without honor, that's not good for a nation either. So we have to find a way to honor the good and to highlight that and teach it today.
So it sounds like then the book, even though it's based on history, Reformation of America, it's quite timely also, because I do think we're in a time where there possibly a time of transition, or certainly there's an element of society that would like to see some transition. So who do you feel like is the ideal audience for this book? Who would you like to see buy the book?
I think it's ideal for equipping Christians primarily, people especially going into college. When I was in the university, there was so much pushback against anything America. It was like you didn't want to be an American. It was constant push against that. It was more of a Marxist push, a postmodern push. And I think that young people going into college need to be rooted and have that theology for a nation, theology for our heritage, for freedom, for liberty, for where the roots of our equality and capitalism come from, because college will, secular universities will dismantle that. And even sometimes Christian universities are using secular textbooks. So I think it would be really good for people to get, for their college age students, children, to undergird them before they go into the university. And then just for anyone who just wants to refresh their history and really appreciate American history again and bring it forward. And with my very short chapters, it's a good book for people who don't even want to, aren't so interested in reading a big history book. I'm really good at making the points very salient and only pulling forward what they really need, rather than having to wade through a whole lot of long chapters.
That sounds like a really usable book then for a lot of people. I like the idea of having really short chapters. People could even do this together as a family or as a group. I even wonder, at one point in time, I taught citizenship classes for refugees who were preparing for their naturalization exam. And that might even be a nice perspective for people who are coming to this country to get a healthier perspective on American history. That's
true. That would be a good resource for them as well.
Well, I know that sometimes the pendulum swings one direction and then swings the other way too. And I think that there has been times in the recent past where maybe the pendulum towards ethnocentrism was probably a little bit too far in one direction for Americans. And I think you're right, though, that right now that pendulum has swung very far in the opposite direction, where it's not fashionable, could I say, to be an American. Even if you are an American, it's not fashionable to think highly of being so or to respect the history of the country. I think that each of us during our point in time in history, because we're all making history, we're making our own history, we're doing the very best we can with what we have at hand. It's important, though, that we're building on something that has gone before and has withstood the test of time. And I think that the principles that the country was built on, because they were biblical principles, have certainly stood the test of time. I mean, how can you build on anything other than truth and have it stand? Yeah.
The further we get away from truth, the more things fall apart, and the more we don't know why they're falling apart, because we're so distant from how they used to be. I'm meeting more and more people that don't have any idea. They even marriage, they don't know what that is. They don't, they're even married. I work for an attorney, and I was talking to a guy one day, and he just couldn't even come up with a term. It took a while for me to find out that he was married. It was like, concept was like missing from his vocabulary. And the more that we get away from that kind of discipleship, where people understand the different components of life, and these things are biblical, and that they don't know how to function without that. And we need to disciple in everything and not consider anything off limits or anything common sense, to make an idea that, oh, they already know this or they should know this. And we get angry at the world for not understanding things and not knowing things. And they don't know because they have never been taught. And it's not just that they're, don't want to do what's right. They don't know what's right, and they're just lost.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the issue of discipleship can't happen unless we have conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable to have. And the church in recent years, at least, hasn't been really great at having some of those conversations. One of the good things I think that has happened is that people are willing to enter into the conversation a little bit, but they are coming at it from a different perspective and not grounded in truth, but maybe grounded a little bit more in cultural perspectives or contemporary perspectives that don't have a foundation to them. It's confusing, especially for young people, but also people in my age bracket. If they don't know why they believe what they believe, that's why young people today aren't buying into traditional values, is because people in my age bracket may have a belief that's based on the Bible, but they don't know why. They can't back it up. And young people today have no interest in buying something that doesn't have a foundation to it. They're not going to buy into a concept unless you can tell them why.
Francis Schaeffer is one of my favorite authors, and he has this quote about having to know the ebb and flow of culture. Otherwise, what you're trying to teach will fall on deaf ears. And so I've really taken that to heart to try to learn how people think that I want to talk to, so that I'm not using words that offend and in a concept in a way that offends without explaining, without saying, no, when I say nation, I'm not saying something that's harmful to people. This is what I mean by nation. Or if I use, truth, I'm not trying, that's not something to oppress you. Let me explain how truth frees you. And understanding how those words are heard today should help us be able to define them in a way that we can mediate the difference and explain more where we're coming from, instead of just throwing them out there in this, polarized argument that doesn't go anywhere, because neither one of us are listening to the other. A couple of years talking to atheists online, and I learned so much about Christianity getting to know atheists, because I learned how I'd read all the apologetics books, and I thought I was armed with all the truth to really, get them all saved or whatever. And I learned so much more about myself and about truth, listening to them and how they heard me and their frustrations. And I came to a place where I was actually trying to help them versus the Christians like me who were coming in trying to get them saved. And I was like, no, wait, guys, you can't talk to them this way. And so I became like their advocate for treating them fairly and kind of representing them, not because I agreed with their worldview, but because they're people that are dignified. And it made them my friends. And it was really an interesting, amazing experience. And that's why today I try and learn so much about people who disagree with me.
That's great. I wish everyone tried to learn about people who disagreed with them, because then we can actually challenge our own beliefs and either be stronger in them or grow and come to a new perspective. I cannot say that everything that I think I know today that I really know, because I only know that because I can look back at maybe at beliefs I had in the past that I don't feel the same way about anymore. And so I assume that there's probably one or two things that I hold on to today that may yet be challenged in the future. So we'll see what points of growth that I'll still go through. And I try to remain open enough to know that I don't know it all yet. One of the times that I really grew in my writing was when I took a writing course in college from a professor who was a Buddhist. And he knew right up front that I was a Christian and I wanted to do writing for the course that was applicable to my work. And he said that was fine. And so it was going to be primarily directed towards a Christian audience. But he constantly challenged me saying, what does this even mean? And I found out my writing was so full of Christianese. Some people talk about it, or our Christian colloquialisms, that it becomes meaningless. And we can throw around these words that you only know what they mean if you're in the club, or even do we know what they mean? Or we just say it because it makes it sound more spiritual.
Until we're asked a question and then we're like, what? And then we get all emotional in response and we're not helping them at all. And that's why I've learned to enjoy that process of learning from and how I sound and how I'm coming across, and go, oh, well, when I say this and make this argument, this is what's being heard. And that's not what I'm trying to tell them. So I need to find another way, rather than getting angry at them and tell them they're supposed to hear what I'm telling them.
Right.
That's the way we do it. No, you're supposed to understand and you're wrong, and it's like, no, sometimes we're not being understandable, because we don't understand them.
Well, I think that for anyone who's an author or a Christian communicator of any kind, but especially since most people who will listen to this interview, most of them will be probably Christians, but whoever, I think remembering to keep your audience in mind and not use that lingo, because even generationally, we can cut people off, not knowing that it has changed in the generations, but definitely we're not going to reach a wider audience, and we're not going to bring meaningful communication until we can actually say, what does that terminology mean in a real sense, rather than just using the easy phrases that have been coined through the years. So you said this was your most recent book. Tell me, what else have you written, Karla?
Before that, I wrote Back to the Future, Rebuilding America's Stability. So similar theme, more of my own personal story, experiencing in the university, a lot of my experiences with professors giving me a really hard time for being a Christian, which also shaped me a lot, and digging more into worldview and apologetic studies, because I was so almost under assault in the university. The professors would single me out. It was nuts how much that they would just almost attest that they had a outspoken Christian in their class that wasn't, I wasn't mean or anything, but I would respond if they were saying something that wasn't true, and teaching an entire class ideas that just weren't, like, there's no truth. And so I wrote about that. And I also cover lots of different subjects, philosophy, government, journalism, and where we went off-road in different times in history and where America needs to get back on the road. So I hit little areas going through the different 7 mountains of culture. But I spent a lot of time on education, which is also, I just wrote a chapter in The Third Education Revolution, which is a book by Vishal Mangalwalde. It's a compilation about 26 authors, and edited by Vishal Mangalwalde and David Marshall. And it's a collaborative work to help to restore education in the world. I mean, it's a massive project, global authors. And my chapter was, again, those experiences in University of the Secular Humanism Worldview. So that's my most recent writing project, is providing that chapter, again, visiting those accounts in the university that really drove me on this path of writing.
And that book is just coming out now, is that correct?
It is. It's out on Kindle now, and it'll be out in print very soon, in the next few weeks.
Very exciting. And that's a big, like you said, it's global authors, and that one is being published in multiple languages for use around the world, right?
Right now, yes, it is. And you'd find The Third Education Revolution, and looking up Vishal Mangalwalde.
So it sounds like you love history, and you really stand for truth, and you're self-proclaimed outspoken about it. And I have noticed that you are a woman, and I think that sometimes is a little bit stereotypical, more of a man to be. This is more a man's world, I think. Have you found that to be true?
I've been, different people have asked me to write. Sometimes they hear that I'm an author, and they'll say, well, would you like to write a travel piece or on cooking? Maybe you have a recipe. And I'm like, it's like, check my books out first, because it's very different, than what most people are peg me for, what I'd probably be writing about. So I do find that different. I'm pretty big fan of Nancy Pearcey, who learned under Francis Schaeffer, and that she has, done this path before me, writing in worldview apologetics. So there are others, but it's few.
Yeah, women aren't supposed to be so argumentative, Karla. So thank you for being there and standing up and taking this on. I really appreciate that. What are you thinking about next? What are you thinking are the big issues that really need to be tackled?
I want to do more on worldview. I would really like to get a book out on worldview and helping people in the fundamentals of thinking and the process of thinking, and how to develop a healthy biblical worldview. There's a lot of misconception that worldview gets narrowly defined just in terms of doctrines about salvation and doctrines about the Bible. And we judge whether someone has a Christian worldview based on that idea. I want to broaden it, and I want to talk more about how worldview affects all of life, and how we need to develop thinking Christianly about literally everything. One time, when my husband and I pastored for 11 years, and one time I was preaching one Sunday, and I was talking about a theology of sleep. And I was talking about the routines of sleep and getting sleep and just being able, I just took that as a small example that how we can think biblically, we can think kingdom about just a small facet of our life, whether it's how we tend our garden or how we take care of our house, all the way up to how we run a nation. To get people thinking about how to think biblically about everything in our lives rather than just, oh, I fall into bed when I want to, I get up when I want to. There's so much that more life-giving if we think about it and think, how does this fit in my day, and how does this fit in the whole picture of what God has me doing in a day?
I think that it's hard for people to think about worldview because it's so foundational and formational that it underlies our thinking and beliefs in a subconscious level. And so how to transform our thoughts on that level, it's not really easy to do. And I think the only way to, in my mind, you can help me here, I'm sure, because you're more of an expert than I am. But I think the only way to get that worldview in a biblical perspective is by internalizing the Bible.
Well, the more you read it, the more it gets into you, but you also have to read it in a way that's sort of going backwards just to understand the words and the doctrines better. We have to pull it forward to apply it to our life. And a lot of times we don't do that. We only look at it as devotionally, or we look at it something to meditate on, or something just to feed our soul, but we don't necessarily look on it as to, what is this saying about my business? What is this saying about how I run my home, or how I live life, how I do entertainment, arts, any of it. Francis Schaeffer has a book out, Art in the Bible. He's applying the Bible to art. And a lot of times we don't take that next step to actually let it speak to our worldview. We consider other things to learn about government or teaching or education rather than the Bible telling us about that.
I think you're so right. One time, and I don't even remember who it was who taught me this. I wish that I did, because I would like to give them credit for it. But I like to take pictures. And I took this photo that I absolutely love this photo. And I wanted to make it somehow devotional or Christian, if you will. And so my thought for how to do that was to plaster a scripture verse over the top of my photo, right? And then someone said, why is the photo not enough? Isn't that worshipful? Isn't it enough? And absolutely, it is. It doesn't have to have a scripture verse on it to make it spiritual.
That is so true. I've tried to tell people, doing a good job in plumbing so that your pipes work well, that is doing something that takes thought and wisdom and the wisdom of God to lay those pipes right, to do that work well. And we don't have to have a fish on the back of our plumbing vehicle. You can show your workmanship, your craftsmanship, your innovation, of being a Christian business without the verse, and it's fine to have the verse, but it needs to be able to stand on its own. Because
the worst thing ever is to be in traffic with an offensive driver with a fish on the back of their car. You can don't put the fish on there. You can drive like a Christian without a fish or with a fish. Both are fine, but it should be.
Yeah. Right.
And so it should speak a message regardless. And I think we want to get to the easy part. The easy part is putting a label on something. The hard part is having integrity, speaks the worldview. I love that idea. And I hope that you do some writing on worldview, because the more that we try to think about our worldview, the less we're actually focusing on the worldview. I think we're thinking about something that's higher at a different level, but the worldview is very deep within us.
It's true. It's like seeing through our glasses, where we stop thinking that we're looking through lenses, but the optometrist has to think about the lenses that we're using so that we see well. We don't think about that, but when we think about the worldview, it's like focusing in on what lenses we're seeing through, and then using that concept on literally everything, and that does take a lot of work and a lot of mental work, because that's the part that we usually stop thinking about. And if we don't think about it at the beginning, we won't be able to think clearly. But once we have it in place, it's like looking through glasses. We don't have to think about it for a while. But when we
Right.
have that, we talked about earlier, that changing our perspective and growing, we think we're working with the amount of truth we have right now, but we hope to grow into more and more. And you look back and see how you change. And that's how you know you're growing in your worldview. And it's biblical repentance, changing the way that we think. And to do that process, we shouldn't think the same way we did 5 years ago.
Right. And the way that we get to that, I think, is by being the body of Christ together, by listening to podcasts like this and expanding our sphere of knowledge, to reading books that will help expand our sphere of knowledge and perspective, but not just reading them and accepting everything that is said, but reading it and really examining it and deciding, is this worthy to accept? Because there's a lot of stuff written out there that isn't worthy. And anyone can be an author nowadays. It becomes quite easy. But to write something that really stands and is worth incorporating into your worldview, that takes a lot of care and thought. It's a huge responsibility also.
It is. It takes a lot of, I read probably over 100 books to write the 2 books that I wrote, and in that over a lifetime before writing, it was just feeding and learning, and then being able to distill that so that readers they might not read the 100 books I read, but they can read what I got from it, and I can make that.
Well, thank you for doing that, all that work for us. Karla, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to watch for that book on worldview that you'll write someday, or if they just want to connect with you?
The best way is my website. It's www.karlaperry.com. So really simple. It's my name. And I'm also have a Facebook page that I keep up, a fan page. You can just look up my name, Karla Perry, for my author page and follow me there.
As we wrap up today, what is one resource that maybe you could point people to that they want more information on this subject, apart from, of course, your books and things like that? What is another resource that people should really check out who want to be thoughtful about maybe their worldview, or about how history is applied to the world today?
The book that really shifted everything for me was The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi. And I recommend that probably more often than I recommend my own books. It just really impacted me a great deal. And that's why today I've contributed a chapter to Vishal's book, because that book impacted me so much. So that would be a big one that I would recommend.
Karla, it's been so great to talk to you today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be on there today. Thank you so much.
Drawn Onward is more than an amazing palindrome. It's a production of TeresaJanzen.com.